In my last video, I argued for skeptical theism and showed how it undermines Rowe's evidential argument from evil. In this video, I will defend skeptical theism against skeptical objections by covering the work of philosopher Perry Hendricks in his paper, Skeptical Theism Unscathed: Why Skeptical Objections to Skeptical Theism Fail. I will cover the objection from divine deception and the objection from divine testimony. Let's start with the objection from divine deception. The objection from divine deception argues that if skeptical theism is true, then we should be skeptical about whether God is deceiving us about the propositions that we have by word of God only justification. God could have reasons beyond our understanding for deceiving us, and hence we should remain agnostic on whether what God says is true. This reasoning is meant to mirror skeptical theism, since just as, according to skeptical theism, we should be skeptical about our ability to know that an instance of suffering is gratuitous because of our limited knowledge, we should also be skeptical about our ability to know that God is telling us the truth because of our limited knowledge as well. Atheist philosopher Eric Wielenberg gives a formal presentation of this argument as follows. Premise 1. If skeptical theism is true, then for any divine assertion that P, we lack justification for believing that it's false or unlikely, that God's act of intentionally asserting that P, when P is false, has beyond our ken justification. Premise 2. If, for any divine assertion that P, we lack justification for believing that it's false or unlikely, that God's act of intentionally asserting that P when P is false has beyond our ken justification, then we do not know P if P has word of God justification only, unless we have a good reason for thinking that, even if God has some justification for lying about P, God doesn't act on that justification. Premise 3. So skeptical theism implies that we do not know any proposition that has word of God justification only, again, unless we have good reason for thinking that, even if God has some justification for lying, God does not act on that justification. Premise 4. We do not have good reason for thinking that, even if God has some justification for lying, God doesn't act on that justification. Conclusion: therefore skeptical theism implies that we do not know any proposition that is word of God only justification. He further argues for symmetry between divine hiddenness and skeptical theism as follows. Premise 1. We don't know how complete our axiological knowledge is. Premise 2. So, we do not know how likely it is that God's act of permitting E has beyond our ken justification. Conclusion: therefore, E's inscrutability does not justify the claim that E is, or is likely to be, gratuitous, i.e., the noseium inference fails. The main problem with the argument arrives at premise 2. Premise 2 can be rejected by appealing to epistemic externalism. Epistemic internalism holds that for S to know P, she must, at least potentially, be aware of that which warrants her true belief that P. Epistemic externalism denies this. They hold that as long as S's belief was formed in the right way, she knows P. Whether she is actually or potentially aware of the fact that her belief was formed in the right way does not matter. Recall my video defending Alvin Planting's proper functionalist account of warrant. That account was an externalist one. So allow me to use proper functionalism to highlight why premise 2 is false. First, remember the conditions required for warrant under proper functionalism. S knows P if and only if 1. S believes P, 2. P is true, 3. Her belief was formed by properly functioning cognitive faculties successfully aimed at producing true beliefs, and 5. She is in an appropriate epistemic environment. Hendricks clearly explains how this undercuts premise 2 when he writes, quote, the proper functionalist conditions for knowledge, i.e., 1 through 5, are obviously compatible with the truth of the antecedent of premise 2, and the falsity of its consequent. That is, it is no doubt possible that S's belief that P, that is based on testimony, is formed by properly functioning cognitive faculties, etc., thus amounting to knowledge, and that S lacks justification for believing that it is false or unlikely that God, who testified that P, has morally justifying reasons for deceiving her. Hence, externalists should reject premise 2. So the argument proves to be a failure on that front alone. However, there is an even more fundamental problem with the argument. Namely, divine deception is disanalogous to skeptical theism. Consider the argument Wielenberg gives us for the supposed symmetry between the two. Divine deception targets basic beliefs, while skeptical theism targets the noseum inference of evidential arguments from evil. They have fundamentally different targets, and thus a symmetry cannot be drawn. Moreover, the symmetry argument Wielenberg provides is not skeptical theism, or at least not the kind of skeptical theism I defended in my last video. Skeptical theism does not make use of the inference from premise 1 to premise 2. It is an inference blocker, not an inference itself. More importantly, skeptical theists who are externalists will reject the inference from premise 1 to premise 2, and therefore skeptical theism cannot be identical to the symmetry argument Wielenberg provides. This is because the proper functionalist conditions for knowledge are obviously compatible with accepting premise 1 and rejecting premise 2. Therefore, there is no symmetry between divine deception and skeptical theism. Now, a defender of divine deception might object that the skeptical theist can know, i.e., there is no morally justifying reason for God deceiving me about X. However, if the skeptical theist can know that, it seems to follow that an atheist who accepts skeptical theism can know that there's no morally justifying reason for this instance of evil, i.e., this evil is gratuitous. This parallel isn't a problem. Skeptical theism attacks noseum inferences in certain arguments from evil and undermines the beliefs that are based on them. Skeptical theism never claimed to defeat all arguments from evil. The fact that the belief that evil is gratuitous could possibly be knowledge does not negate skeptical theism, so this symmetry is of no importance to skeptical theism. Now, there could be other problems with an argument from evil that focuses on externalism, but such a debate is independent of skeptical theism. Hence, for the reasons previously discussed, the skeptical theist is justified in dismissing the objection from divine deceptions. A very similar objection to skeptical theism is the objection from divine testimony. This is the objection put forward by philosopher Hud Hudson. It focuses on the reasons we have for trusting the testimony delivered to us by God. We can put the argument formally as follows. Premise 1. For any belief that we have based solely on God's testimony, if that belief amounts to knowledge, then we have positive reasons for trusting God with respect to that instance of testimony. Premise 2. We do not have positive reasons for trusting God in respect to any instance of testimony C. Therefore, conclusion. No belief we have based solely on God's testimony amounts to knowledge. Now, what can be made of this argument? Well, to start, Hudson's argument assumes reductionism about testimonial knowledge. However, non-reductionism is considered the more plausible view in contemporary epistemology. Non-reductionists hold that if S believes P on the basis of R's testimony, S does not need positive reasons to trust R in respect to her testimony that B. It just needs to be formed in the right way. Now, obviously, if non-reductionism about testimonial knowledge is true, then premise 1 is false and the argument is unsound. So the scope of Hudson's argument is greatly diminished based on this point alone. But beyond this, Hudson's argument runs into much the same problems that plagued Wielenberg's argument. Epistemic externalism renders premise 1 of Hudson's argument false. Suppose that S holds some belief P on the basis of God's testimony. Suppose further that S's belief that P is true and formed in such a way that the conditions for warrant under proper functionalism are met. If that's the case, then contra premise 1, S's belief amounts to knowledge by externalist standards. With these 2 points in mind, we can safely dismiss the argument from divine testimony. Now, in this video, I've defended skeptical theism against the objection from divine deceptions and the objection from divine testimony. In my next video, I will defend skeptical theism against global skepticism. See you then.